Hello everyone, welcome back to a new Flesh and Blood video. Today we're going to be talking about controlling your fate in the game of Flesh and Blood, and whether it's possible and ways you can do it. Let's get straight into it. Just before we do that, I just want to say this took a lot of time to get ready and plan, so I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe and like the video. Okay, let's get straight into it, shall we? So, controlling your fate in Flesh and Blood. Let's get into it. So, control what you do. These are the questions we've got to ask ourselves when we're thinking about controlling the fate of the game. So what does your deck do? So you've got to know what your kind of plan is with your deck and what it actually does. Do you disrupt? Do you attack with lots of damage? Do you try and play cards from their graveyard? Like, what does your deck actually do? What do the cards physically do? Do you attack with weapons? Do you attack with attack action cards? What's your game plan? And that's the next one. What is your game plan? So what do you want to do with these cards? So basically, once you understand what your cards actually do, you want to figure out a plan for those cards. The next thing is, how do you change your plan? So once you've identified a plan, say the plan is disrupting your opponent until they can't play any cards left in their deck, they've completely drawn all of them or fatigued them. What if that plan's not working? How do you change that? Can you change it? And does your deck have the ability to do that? So what's your mid-game flexibility? So thinking about this, whether you have multiple game plans and if you can change them, what is your flexibility to change them? Like, if you're in the middle of a game, you're trying to fatigue them, you're realizing you've taken too much damage, you're not going to be able to fatigue them, or they just have too many cards in their deck, they've fat decked well, and they've been able to hit the right cards at the right time, and you're struggling to realize, oh, they're actually winning the fatigue race, you're actually at the same cards. What's your flexibility to change your game plan into an aggro or mid-range style that you can actually kill them through taking their life total to 0 rather than fatiguing them? How good is your deck at changing that plan? So you figured out what's your plan, how to change your plan, how flexible is that plan, and how good is your deck at actually changing it? If you're playing a fatigue deck, some fatigue decks are better at changing their plan to killing their opponent better than others. Some decimated decks, not really seen in the meta very much anymore, but I could very well see one coming back at any point in time, is can that deck actually present enough damage to kill your opponent through their blocks? And if it can't, it's not very good at changing its plan, or you've got to think of a separate plan to change to. So the next one is, does your deck present you with multiple options or playstyles? So does your deck have one specific way to play? So, like, for example, think of an aggro deck, any sort of aggro deck. Does that deck just play aggro? Can all it do is just attack every turn? Is that all it's capable of doing? Or is it capable of swapping to a mid-range plan or a fatigue plan? One great example of this, where it has multiple playstyles, is Dash Inventor Extraordinaire, which, with the switchboard style, you can go from a heavy fatigue deck to a mid-range to aggro deck. It's very strong at swapping its playstyle. May not be the peak spot in the meta right now, but there's a reason it has the most Living Legends points, and that is because it's so flexible, and that's why people choose to use that, because they like having those options. How well does your sideboard play into your matchup spread? So this is really important. So how flexible is your sideboard as well as your main deck? Because if you're trying to determine the fate of the game, you've got to have some way to beat every deck, right? If you're just accepting that you have auto losses and there's nothing you can do about them, then you're not controlling your fate, because all you have to do is pair into that one Enigma as an assassin player, and it's over for you. So you've got to think, how well does your sideboard play into your matchups? And you want to build your sideboard as efficiently as you can into a wide spread of matchups to give you at least chances in every matchup. Because if you're going and just accepting that you've got a 0% win rate matchup or a 95-5, you're just going to really struggle with having control over your game, especially in big tournaments where you can't afford a misstep. You need to be able to have a game plan into every deck, no matter how bad it is, because if you don't, that one loss could be costing you a chance at day 2 or a top 8. Moving on, controlling what your opponent does. What does your matchup spread look like? So this is really important when you're picking a deck, if you're looking for as much autonomy as you can. And this is because if you're choosing a deck that has so many of those 95-5 matchups, then it's just not going to be a good deck if you want to have control. And I'm not saying you shouldn't play those decks, but if you're looking for as much control on the game as you can, removing as many factors as you can, then you can't play a deck that has too many 95-5 matchups. You're looking for maybe one with 1 or 2. And that might just be to one specific class, like new into Illusionist, is you struggling against Prism and Enigma, but you have winnable matchups into everything else. And you've got to be looking for one of those decks. If your deck struggles into half the meta, then you're not going to have control over your outcome. Next one is, what's your game plan into your worst deck? I touched on this before, but this is really important, so I brought it up again in this slide. So what is your plan for those worst decks, those 95-5 matchups? You need to have a plan to make them not 95-5, because if you lose that one game, it could cost you the tournament. So, and especially if you queue into that deck multiple times, it's big in the meta, but you really like this deck and it does give you autonomy in other matchups, you have to be thinking about this, and you need to have a game plan into those really bad matchups, even more so than your good matchups. If you have an amazing matchup in something where they just struggle to even play their cards, you don't need as solid of a game plan, because at the end of the day, your cards beat their cards. But in this case, your cards don't beat their cards. Their cards beat you like every time. So you need a specific game plan. You need to identify your win conditions and play them out to control what your opponent does. Next one is, can your deck disrupt your opponent? Some decks have no disruption, and this makes it really hard to... You just play your game, right? And your opponent gets to play their game. And that means you have less control, because if your opponent is better at playing their game than your game, then they could win. And especially if their deck is favored into yours, if you just let them do what they want, it's hard to beat them. And this is why I've got Leave No Witnesses here. This is why I love Assassin personally, because your deck disrupts what they're doing. And even terrible matchups, if your disruption's at the right time, they don't get to play the game. It's just how it works. How does your deck withstand disruption? So this is complete opposite. On the other hand, your deck is getting disrupted. They want to play their game. They're not letting you play your game. How do you withstand to that? Are you good at still playing the game through disruption? Do you have to fight through it? Are you a ninja that just loses the game to disruption? Maybe that's not giving you the autonomy you need. So you really do have to think about how your deck withholds to these Leave No Witnesses, Command and Conquers. Do you end your turn if you get hit with one, or can you still play a 3-card hand blocking 2? And how much does your opponent control your game? If you're playing a deck that is determined when you sit down against your opponent and what deck they're playing and how they run the game, you're not going to have autonomy. If your opponent's running the game, they're deciding what happens, basically. They're deciding how you play. You don't have autonomy, obviously. They're deciding what happens. You're not. You have no control over the game. And honestly, as an Assassin player or as a Flesh and Blood player altogether, I hate not having control, you know? And I'm sure a lot of you guys can relate to that, where you just sitting there and it's disruption after disruption and you feel like you're not playing your game, you're playing their game. You're playing right into their hands. And it's definitely something to think about when you're building your deck and thinking about heroes you'd like to play, is how much does your opponent control your game, and therefore how much autonomy do you have on your own deck. The next one is, how does difficulty play into this equation? So I've got Kano up there. He's a very difficult deck. Just throwing it out there. And here we go. So does your deck play itself? So some decks, honestly, I can definitely feel some backlash for this comment. But sometimes hands just play themselves. Sometimes you just have one option. Sometimes you're playing Azalea. You have a arrow in arsenal. You know what's on the top of your deck. You can't play it. You've just got buffs and you play your card. That is your turn. It's played itself. You look at your hand, you know exactly what you need to do. It's not difficult, but it also means there's lack of flexibility. When there's such an obvious right answer, there are a few other answers that are correct, right? Let me explain that more. So if you have a hand that has one correct answer, there are no other right answers. Whereas if you have a deck that presents multiple different lines, all with varying strength, you actually get to look at all of them and see how that plays into your specific game plan against the specific hero you're playing against. If you have one line with Azalea, and you just have to play that line, no matter what hero you're against, you just have to play that line. And that's the thing, is that line won't work for every matchup. Hey, maybe it will completely destroy a Dorinthia, just overpowering them, filling them with frailty and poor on hits that disrupt their turn. Or you'll play against a new, and it won't matter. None of those on hits will matter. They'll come back, they'll block with 3 cards in hand, come back with the CNC, disrupt your arsenal. And that's the thing, is how much does your hand play itself? Which leads into the second point. Do you have multiple lines in each hand? So I touched on this before. If you're playing a hero like Nu, you are so often presented with different lines. Which dagger do you attack with? Do you attack with go again first, or a dagger with go again? figure out when's that on hit necessary. Do you attack with your Bonds of Agony first, holding all cards in your hand, even if you know all you can do is give it go again? Or do you send a dagger into Bonds, give them less cards to question them about, but your relevant on-hit is stronger because of the dagger's on-hit effect? It's these questions you have to ask yourself, and this is where you improve your play. This is where you can improve at the game. And I think this is honestly one of my favorite parts of Flesh and Blood, is this sort of strategy here. And when your hands play themselves, they don't give you as much autonomy as you like. Although Azalea doing a 14 dominate turn with all these buffs and a super strong arrow on hit is no means bad. And I'm not saying it's bad, but I'm saying it doesn't give you much autonomy. And if that's something you really look for in Flesh and Blood or in card games, you want to have as much control on the game as you can. That's the best way to go about it. Especially with Flesh and Blood lacking the signature control decks you see in Magic, where with blue and counter spells where you control the board state. There's not much of a board state in Flesh and Blood. And with Illusionists, because of the mechanics they have with ward and being able to attack into them, there's also not much of an ability to just completely control the board state unless you've snowballed away from your opponent and are in such a leading spot that you have complete control of the board. A lot of the time your board can be cleared. And finally, what is the power level of the other lines, and how does that play into your matchup? So this is very similar to what I said before. So say you're playing a deck with multiple lines, but only one of them strong. It's similar to Azalea. You might have other options, but is it actually worth exploring? And that's the thing. New, I talk a lot about New. They are my hero. I have a lot of experience on New, and it's just so good because you do have multiple lines and they all do different things depending on your time. And that's where I put it apart from a deck like Azalea, where you probably only have one really, really strong line, or there is one objectively correct line, but it might not be objectively correct in some matchups. And in those matchups, you don't have separate options. So that is it for the deck difficulty equation. And now we've got, so what decks should you and should you not play if you're looking for autonomy in your game? So, we're going to start off with decks you should play. Ooh. So, I'm obviously going to start off with New here. I've talked a lot about New in those slides. And we'll just go quickly over why I think you should play these heroes. New is because of the plethora of disruption. Command and Conquer, Codex of Frailty, Leave No Witnesses, just a nick on these super relevant on hits. This can destroy. Play against Brute, you take a Blood Rush from their hand, take the rest of them from their deck, you've destroyed them. Persuasive Prognosis, it's such a small attack, but it requires a block because it takes a card out of the hand anyway. It's got defensive capabilities. It's got all these strong cards that pair with constant, every single turn disruption with Mask of Recurring Nightmares. This is the Calling Osaka second list. It's quite a strong list. It's got stuff like a Race Face, just even more disruption. It works extremely well. Moving on. We've got Kano. There's going to be haters and lovers for Kano. But at the end of the day, the current state of Kano is he's not the best deck in the format. Certainly not the best deck. But I'm talking about autonomy and the fact that you literally determine how your game's going to go. It's just shown so clearly here in Kano. This is the Sydney Battle Hardened list from a guy I knew back in Sydney who won the Battle Hardened. It was very impressive watching him play. And this deck, at the end of the day, if you're a really good Kano player, you can win with this deck consistently. Just using Open the Floodgates, super strong, pitch stacking, and that's how you win with it. You pitch stack Kano, and you blast them. And if you're good enough at Kano, you can win so many matchups because at the end of the day, it really relies on your skill and less of your opponent's skill to beat you. Although people that do know how to play Kano matchups, they're a lot better into Kano than non-Kano matchup players. But at the end of the day, this deck allows you to control your fate, as Kano is essentially playing against yourself the whole time. So that's how I feel about Kano. I do love him. I did play him before. And then Ira. Ira is honestly the newest hero into Classic Constructed, other than Jarl, who I'm not touching on in this video. Consistent damage, honestly. She just does the things she needs to do. She has those disruption cards, Command and Conquer, Censor. She's got a lot of defense reactions for stuff like assassins or rangers that she needs to block out. And it's also got that switchboard plan of that, can you change your plan mid-game? from a defensive plan to an aggro plan with Razor Reflex, natural go-agains, and further disruption with all this go-again. So I think Ira is definitely one of those perfect decks to show the autonomy, because you can swap your game plan really quick. You put consistent damage, and you do strong things with disruption. Moving on from Ira, we've got the last one that I recommend, and it's Enigma. It's hard to not include Enigma because Enigma is probably the strongest deck in the format, but I specifically include this list from Osaka 5th place. And that's because of the plethora of disruption and the ability to change its game plan to doing a lot of damage with Miraging Metamorph, Phantasmaclasm. The key disruption cards being, of course, Weakest Link, Command and Conquer, and Pummels, as well, to take cards out of your opponent's hand. This deck does strong things, paired with disruption, and the ceiling of it being able to... It can honestly fatigue. Let's be honest, with the plethora of 3 blocks, defense, reactions, and ward, this deck can almost certainly fatigue you, while also pushing over vast amounts of damage with great on-hits. So moving on from the decks you should play, I'm going to talk about decks you shouldn't play. And I'm probably going to... I just need to rephrase. These are not decks you shouldn't play, because these are strong decks. But if you're looking to play Flesh and Blood with as much autonomy as you can, I don't recommend these decks purely because of their playstyle and nature. But these are very strong decks. Don't get me wrong. 2 of these decks that I've included here are top performing Worlds and Cooling decks, as we can see here, Cooling 5th place. This is Azalea. The reason I struggle with Azalea so much is, honestly, there are so many decks that can brick in this game, as we all know, but Azalea has such a big reputation of just drawing a bunch of pumps, no arrows, as well as Warmongers being so painful, and everyone's playing Warmongers at the moment. It's in almost every single deck you see at the top level, and it really destroys Azalea. Not so much on Runeblade anymore. Runeblade's learnt to play around it, but Azalea still can't do it. Azalea still struggles. You can't get those arrows pumped up enough, so you just don't have the strongest turn. Although running 6 of these, which gives this disruption, this is what the decklist has going for it. It does have a lot of disruption, but if you get on the back foot, it's so tough to come back because you can brick so easily. You can just give your opponent a time walk because of the nature of the deck. Moving from Azalea is FaB. This is my FaB list. I love FaB. FaB is so fun, but let's be honest. He gets destroyed by assassins, gets absolutely walked through, and with very, very little disruption. Mind that, no disruption rather than other than Warmongers maybe against Azalea. No disruption. All this deck is power, and it presents power. I think it's good, and I really think you guys should try it out, but at the end of the day, it is not so strong. Into disruption, into autonomy, you have to draw the right hands. If you draw a bad hand and your opponent draws a good one, you can get destroyed pretty easily. He can burn himself, and that's the thing. I do like him. I think you should play him, but not if you want autonomy. Just not going to happen for you. And finally, this is probably the most controversial out of the 3, is Aurora. This is my personal experience with Aurora. She's so strong, obviously. Mercy Pickle's list that came second at the World Championship was very consistent, but because of the plethora of instance that she can't filter like Acilio, and don't get me wrong, I don't think Acilio is too good of a hero, but because of the amount of instance you can draw with absolutely no filtering, you can draw a hand where you actually can't do anything, not even block. And the great thing I love about Flesh and Blood is that if you draw a shit hand, you can block with it, preserve your life, and just try again next time. Not with a handful of instance. Handful of instance, you're absolutely cooked. Your best attack is Starfall for 1. Maybe Starfall for 4, depending on like what you have. But not being able to block and not being able to attack, what do? You're just absolutely done. And that's why I've put it here. I definitely not saying you shouldn't play this deck. Honestly, play this deck. It's so strong. But I do have to just throw that out there because I think it's important. As well as she doesn't have much disruption. She just has Warmongers. The only really disruptive card. She just does powerful things with Channel Lightning and Sigil of Suffering. It's a very fun combo. I learned that yesterday. But yeah, I definitely don't think you should. I'm not saying you shouldn't play these decks. But anyway, let's go back to the slideshow. Conclusion. So, controlling your fate can be the most rewarding way to play the game, as you know if you won, it's because you played well. And if you lost, then you made mistakes, other than the few cases where you do just get high rolled, and that is inevitable. Anyway, 98% of you guys are not subscribed. So if you would hit that red button, it would mean a lot to me. While you're down there, why not leave a comment giving me some feedback about this format of video and let me know if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I really do appreciate all the support the channel's been getting lately, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.